Methuselah is one of the most enigmatic figures in the Bible. He lived for 969 years, the greatest age ever recorded in Scripture. Yet, unlike other names in Genesis, almost nothing is said about what he did during that time. The Bible preserves only two elements about Methuselah: his age and his place within the lineage that precedes the flood. This silence is unusual, and it has never been treated as a coincidence. When we observe the details preserved in the text, something begins to stand out. His name, in ancient Hebrew, functions as a message. The date of his death aligns precisely with the beginning of the flood, and his position in the genealogy indicates that he was not there merely as another descendant, but as part of a pattern that runs through the entire early history of humanity. All this turns Methuselah into something far greater than a long-lived man. He becomes a marker, a point fixed in the timeline to signify that something decisive was about to occur. Today, we will reconstruct this scenario. We will understand why his life lasted exactly 969 years, why his death marks the threshold before the global judgment, and what this reveals about what was happening on Earth during that period. There are details in this story that have gone unnoticed for centuries, and when placed side by side, they form a picture that completely changes the way we read Genesis. Now we follow the trail left by the text, a path leading to the place where time bends and where every lost cycle finds meaning again: the Valley of Redemption. The name Methuselah appears in Genesis in a discrete manner, among generations that follow one another with speed. The text does not narrate deeds, journeys, or speeches attributed to him. It merely records his birth, his place within the lineage, and the exact age at which he ended his life, 969 years. This number defies any modern expectation, but within the context of the ancient narrative, it serves a role far beyond mere astonishment. The structure of the genealogy in which he appears reveals more than a list of descendants. Each name carries a function, a meaning, a message. And when the text preserves the significance of the name Methuselah in ancient Hebrew, the weight of that choice becomes evident. Its etymology points towards the arrival of something decisive, a coded announcement embedded in a name that has crossed centuries without alteration. As the years pass, the world around him transforms. New cities arise, tools become more sophisticated. Skills once unknown begin to circulate among the peoples. The human landscape expands and warps at the same pace. Violence grows, social structures solidify, strange practices spread among families and villages. Ancient accounts describe a period of intense change in which advancement and corruption move forward side by side. Meanwhile, Methuselah lives. Decades stretch before him as though time were suspended. Other generations complete their cycles and vanish, yet he traverses each one of them. His life functions as an axis, a fixed point that remains while everything around becomes increasingly unstable. And the more the world changes, the more evident the peculiarity of his existence becomes. The figure of his father, Enoch, intensifies this contrast. Enoch is taken from the earth abruptly, described as one who walked with God until he was carried away. He is the only name in that lineage that does not end in death. This interruption suggests direct intervention, a separation before the complete deterioration of the pre-flood world. Methuselah remains, not to take his father's place, but because his life carries a different purpose, not to interrupt time, but to sustain it. The biblical narrative makes it clear that a boundary is approaching. Before the flood, the text records a shift in the relationship between God and humanity. From a certain moment onward, human days would be shortened. It is not a mere biological alteration, but the marker of a preparation. The longevity that characterized the early generations was coming to an end, and Methuselah appears precisely at the transition between this extended world and the world that would be reduced. This transition does not unfold evenly. Violence intensifies, injustice spreads, the integrity of creation is compromised. The earth carries signs of moral and spiritual decay as the antediluvian generation distances itself from its original purpose. Cities become centers of power and ambition, and practices once isolated begin to take root in everyday life. The world leans towards a point of no return. In the midst of this process, Methuselah's life continues. Each prolonged year becomes a suspension, a space that should not exist, yet does. A period preserved despite everything around him collapsing. And it is here that the meaning of his name takes shape. He is not merely another descendant. His life is directly connected to the time remaining before judgment. His death marks the boundary, a limit established from the beginning. When the narrative reaches Noah, Methuselah's great-grandson, the construction of the great vessel occupies decades. The instructions received, the preparation of the timber, the continuous work carried out under the disbelief of those around him. All of this unfolds while Methuselah is still alive. His presence functions as a measure. As long as he breathes, the countdown does not end. When his cycle closes, Genesis records that the flood finally begins. The extraordinary longevity ceases to be only a rare event and becomes part of a greater architecture. Methuselah lived everything that could be lived before the rupture. His death coincides with the exact moment when the world could no longer continue as it was. He is the final piece before the fall, the last marker of an age that could not endure. His story is not built upon visible deeds, but upon a silent and decisive role, holding time open until everything was prepared to change. His name announced this from the beginning. His final year confirmed it. And when his life at last came to an end, the world crossed a boundary from which there was no return. The lineage before the flood is not presented as a random succession of names. Each generation carries its own meaning, and together they form a structure that remains firm while the rest of humanity fractures. The line of Seth, of which Methuselah is a part, preserves more than blood. It preserves a purpose that crosses centuries. The names in this genealogy were not chosen merely out of family tradition. In ancient Hebrew, each one describes an aspect of the human condition and at the same time points towards a promise that was still far ahead. Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah. A sequence which, when read as it was transmitted, forms a complete message. The appointed man, mortal and afflicted, finds hope when the blessed God descends to teach that his work will bring rest to the despairing. The genealogy functions as a condensed prophecy recorded long before the arrival of the flood. Within this structure, Methuselah occupies a critical position. He appears immediately after Enoch, the only man removed from the earth without facing death. Enoch's life ends abruptly, breaking the natural cycle of the generations. His departure opens a space that had not been experienced since creation, suggesting that the world was approaching a decisive point. Methuselah is born within this transition and carries a name that announces what would come next. The extreme longevity that marks his existence contrasts sharply with the condition of humanity around him. Corruption grows, violence spreads, and relations between peoples and families deteriorate. The biblical text describes the earth filling with injustice as strange practices gain strength. The line of Seth remains a continuous thread, yet isolated within an increasingly chaotic environment. In this setting, Methuselah's presence assumes an even greater significance. His life stretches on while degeneration advances. Each year lived becomes part of a necessary interval for the next stage of the story to be reached. The birth of his grandson, Lamech, and later of Noah, takes place under this rising tension. The narrative shows that while society moves further and further from its original path, the line of Seth preserves what still remained of spiritual and moral integrity. Noah does not appear as a surprise. He is the product of a carefully maintained sequence. Methuselah's long, continuous life creates the necessary space for Noah to grow during a time in which the world had already crossed boundaries that could not be ignored. While cities flourish upon distorted foundations and strange practices spread, Noah matures within the only line that still carried the original purpose. This silent preparation shows that history was not moving without direction. Time was being organized around this genealogy, and Methuselah was a central part of that process. His life forms the bridge between the period of extreme longevity and the beginning of the restriction imposed in the chapter that follows. He stands at the exact point where the ancient cycle closes and the new one draws near. The genealogy is not merely a list. It is the path that sustains what is to come. And at its center, the presence of Methuselah prevents time from closing before its appointed hour. As the centuries advance, the human landscape transforms into something that scarcely resembles the peaceful beginning described in Genesis. Population growth accelerates, cities emerge in increasingly distant regions, and new skills begin to spread among the peoples. Rudimentary technology takes its first steps, and ambition follows closely behind. The earth, still young, becomes the stage for deep and rapid changes. The oldest accounts indicate that this period was not merely one of advancement, but also of distortion. Skills once used to sustain families begin to serve the construction of structures that rival nature itself. Tools turn into weapons. The search for knowledge opens space for practices that exceed moral boundaries. Entire peoples engage in dangerous alliances, and violence ceases to be an isolated event, becoming part of everyday life. The biblical text summarizes this scenario with a direct statement. The earth was filled with violence. This is not born from literary exaggeration. It represents a reality that had already surpassed any line of stability. Conflicts between clans intensify, disputes over territory become harsher, and human behavior moves far from any notion of balance. Life, which once stretched across centuries without major ruptures, now carries a constant climate of tension. Methuselah moves through this transformed environment. His longevity allows him to witness changes no one else sees. He sees entire cities rise, observes the spread of practices that move like smoke, and perceives, generation after generation, that the world advances towards an irreversible direction. His life serves not merely as a record of time passing, it becomes the longest observation point of an entire era. The line of Seth, to which he belongs, becomes increasingly isolated. While other families devote themselves to knowledge that enhances their power, this lineage strives to preserve values that grow rarer with each generation. The contrast deepens as new cities rise around centers of dark influence. The social atmosphere becomes unstable, marked by rivalries that exceed any notion of coexistence. The biblical text states that the heart of man was inclined continually towards evil. Often read symbolically, this statement reflects a profound condition. Humanity had lost control over its own impulse. Technological advancement was not accompanied by wisdom. Strength was not used for building, but for domination. Each new resource created more power, and each new generation drifted a little further from what had been established at the beginning. In this scenario, Methuselah's presence assumes a quiet yet decisive role. His longevity prevents the limit from arriving prematurely. His name, tied to a specific announcement, outlines the final permitted interval. As long as he breathes, history remains open. When his cycle closes, the path will be clear for the next chapter. The years pass, and the world reaches a state of rupture. Violence does not decline. Corruption does not slow. Humanity crosses boundaries that cannot be reversed. Powerful leaders rise, supported by practices that challenge the original order of creation. A sense of instability spreads like a cloud that envelops everything. The earth at this point is no longer the same. The initial balance has vanished. What once flourished now decays. What once moved in harmony now advances in conflict. And Methuselah, living far beyond any human expectation, witnesses the moment when deterioration reaches its highest point. The path to the flood did not begin with water falling from the heavens. It began with a slow, continuous transformation of a world that ceased to recognize its own limits. And Methuselah lived long enough to see every stage of that change. When the biblical narrative reaches the period immediately before the flood, the text takes a darker turn. It does not describe only human conflicts or advancements that spiraled out of control. It presents a deeper kind of corruption, one that affects the very structure of humanity. Genesis records that beings called the sons of God began to unite with the daughters of men, and from this union came descendants described as giants. This is not presented as a literary metaphor. The text treats the event as real, marking a moment that produced an irreversible imbalance. These figures, known as the Nephilim, appear as the result of a transgression that surpasses any ordinary moral violation. It alters the course of history. A hybrid generation emerges, bringing excessive strength, extreme violence, and a presence that destabilizes society entirely. Wherever these beings establish themselves, chaos intensifies. Their actions spread like a force that subdues entire peoples. The earth ceases to be merely the stage for human conflict and becomes territory for something far greater than disputes between clans. The violence that follows does not arise gradually. It expands abruptly, accompanying the rise of this new generation. Ancient accounts indicate that cruel practices become frequent. The disproportionate strength of the Nephilim turns ordinary conflicts into open massacres. Entire peoples abandon regions that once were habitable. Their presence alters the balance of the earth and creates an atmosphere of constant threat. This scenario affects not only the stability of cities, but the structure of creation itself. The Hebrew text uses the word shachath to describe the condition of the earth. The term indicates profound ruin, destruction that reaches the essence, often associated with distortion, corrosion, and structural corruption. Humanity was not only straying morally from its original purpose, it was losing the very identity it had been given at the beginning. Meanwhile, Methuselah remains. His life extends across the period in which this transgression spreads. He witnesses the progressive transformation of families, the expansion of violence, and the emergence of these beings who dominate territories and impose fear. His longevity allows him to observe the accumulation of generations contaminated by this rupture. The line of Seth, preserved until then, endures within an increasingly hostile environment. It is in this setting that Noah grows. He does not witness merely a violent world, but a world transformed by interference that corrupted the human essence. His family becomes the last intact representation of the original creation, the only lineage that still preserves the integrity necessary to continue. While the giants expand their dominion and violence becomes the rule, Noah matures within a purpose he does not yet fully understand. The presence of the Nephilim made it clear that the boundary had been crossed. The earth would not withstand another full cycle of generations under such a condition. Corruption was not only behavior, it was mixture. Human identity was being replaced by something incompatible with the plan established from the beginning. The survival of the promise, the lineage, and the mission required direct intervention. It is at this point that the name of Methuselah regains its weight. While he lives, judgment does not begin. Even as violence advances and the distortion of creation spreads, his presence holds the countdown. The world is not destroyed while the marker remains active. And this explains why his lifespan is described with such precision. It is not exceptional longevity, it is granted time. When the environment reaches its peak of deterioration, everything aligns for the transition. The actions of the Nephilim, the corruption of the earth, Noah's position in the genealogy, and Methuselah's continued presence converge towards a single purpose. The ancient era reaches its end, and what comes next can only begin when the countdown finally closes. The boundary is set, the rupture is complete, and every year lived by Methuselah sustains the interval before the approaching judgment. When Noah receives the command to build the ark, the world has already crossed every possible boundary. Violence has become part of daily life. The Nephilim expand their dominion, and the structural corruption that afflicts humanity can no longer be reversed. The construction of the ark stretches over decades, and throughout this entire period, Methuselah remains alive. His existence sustains the final interval before the definitive change. The preparation of the ark is not merely an isolated project within Noah's household. It is the concrete sign that the ancient cycle is coming to an end. Trees are felled, timbers are shaped, structures are raised while the rest of the world continues its path with no comprehension of the magnitude of what approaches. The construction grows slowly, year after year, while Methuselah continues crossing the time that remains. His presence functions as the final marker of this era. The entire world transforms, yet the clock only reaches its end when his life closes. The genealogy confirms this connection. The year of his death is the very year in which the waters begin to fall. There is no deviation, no delay, no gap between the events. The end of the individual cycle coincides with the end of the global one. The line of Seth, preserved since Adam, remains firm only within the household of Noah. The other lines had already drifted entirely from the original intention. As Methuselah reaches his final years, the atmosphere around him shows no sign of improvement. Cities continue advancing towards violence. The dominion of the Nephilim keeps expanding, and the distortion of creation reaches levels that make any gradual restoration impossible. The final period of Methuselah's life is not described, but his position in the narrative shows that each additional year represented an allotted span for Noah to complete what had been commanded. As the labor of decades approaches completion, Methuselah's life likewise approaches its limit. The two trajectories run in parallel, as though the end of one were clearing the way for the other. When he finally reaches the end of his path, time closes. There is no interval, no suspension. What had been determined from the beginning is fulfilled. The name that announced the end accompanies the final breath of the man who bore it. And only a few weeks later, the world faces the greatest rupture since creation. The ancient era ends without resistance. The new cycle begins with the force of the waters, and everything that survived from that time endures within the lineage that managed to cross the boundary. The death of Methuselah marks the precise moment when the allotted time comes to an end. Genesis records that in the very same year his life concludes, the flood begins. This perfect alignment reveals that his existence functioned as a boundary. While he remained alive, the countdown did not advance towards its conclusion. When his path ends, judgment finally begins. Biblical chronologists point out that Methuselah's death occurred only days before the first rains. This interval coincides with the traditional mourning period among ancient Hebrew families. The narrative suggests that the world was still immersed in this moment when the windows of heaven opened. Nothing in that year followed its usual rhythm. The life of one who had spanned nearly a millennium had reached its end, and the world around him crossed the threshold between eras. Meanwhile, the ark was already complete. The structure raised by Noah over decades found its purpose at the exact instant the clock reached zero. The labor that had stretched across generations finally aligned with the appointed moment. The instructions received, the shaped timber, and each detail built in silence became part of the only possible path in that situation. The transition between Methuselah's final breath and the first drops of rain shows that the flood was not an isolated event. It was the closing of a line carefully marked since the earliest patriarchs. The life of each generation formed a segment of this clock, and Methuselah's represented the final movement. After him, there was no room for delay. The line of Seth now consolidates around Noah's family, which carries the full weight of humanity's continuation. The other lines had already diverged to the point of becoming incompatible with the original purpose. When the rain begins, the former world collapses quickly. The cycle that began with Adam closes with the precision announced in the name of one man. The flood does not emerge as an impulsive reaction, but as the direct consequence of a process that had unfolded over centuries. The earth had become unrecognizable, and intervention became inevitable. The ark, prepared over the span of a generation, stands as the only structure capable of crossing the boundary imposed by humanity's own condition. The clock that began on the day of Methuselah's birth reaches its end with exactness. The time granted for decay, violence, and distortion ends the moment he breathes his last. From that point on, the story moves into judgment. The ancient cycle ends, the new begins, and the marker that held the entire interval disappears at the precise instant the first rain touches the earth. The life of Methuselah stretched across centuries until it reached the final boundary of the ancient world. His death marked the moment when humanity could no longer sustain its own existence. When he departed, the allotted time closed, and the cycle that had begun in Eden finally broke. The flood did not arrive as a surprise, but as a consequence, and history continued only with those who were still able to carry the future.